In 1972, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Minneapolis woke up to a nightmare. A woman vanished, kidnapped in broad daylight from her own backyard. But this wasn't random.
The man potentially responsible had already killed.
He'd leave a trail of bodies scattered across the country, some buried, some beaten, some found with claw hammers still lodged in their skull. And the most terrifying part, he was hiding in plain sight, smiling, charming, and keeping a secret that stretched across 7 states and 181 hand-drawn circles on a map. This is part 2 of Harvey Carignan, the serial killer, the man who used wanted ads to lure his victims. If you haven't heard part 1, you can listen to it right now in the REDRUM feed. This is REDRUM, stories about the true victims of crime. I upload on Mondays and Thursdays, so make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. So, in part 1, we heard the story of Kathy Miller, a bright young woman whose disappearance ended in horror. Her body was found hidden in undergrowth, and the man suspected of killing her, Harvey Carignan, was a convicted murderer with a trail of violence behind him, but because of a technicality and an overturn, he was now walking free. But Kathy wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last, because as police dug deeper, Harvey's dark history began to unravel. A kidnapping that really shook the city. There was a woman left bleeding in a cornfield, teenage girls lured into the woods with fake stories and hammers, and one victim survived only because her wig fell off, and it confused him for long enough for her to escape. We will get into all of that. This is where the story goes up a notch. So, police dug deeper and they found that Harvey had once owned a house on that very reservation where Kathy's body was found. It was just 42 miles from where Kathy had last been seen. But still, somehow it wasn't enough for an arrest. And then, people around Harvey started noticing strange things. The twitching came back. Remember we spoke about that at the beginning? It was worse when he was a kid, but now it was back, and actually it was worse than ever. But while Harvey was slowly coming undone in private, something massive was unfolding in public. Something that really shook Minneapolis to its core. By now, it was 1972, and we're going to one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. So we spoke about that very briefly last episode. But let me give you a little bit more detail. So this is Virginia Piper's abduction. She was a socialite, a philanthropist, and the wife of a powerful bank executive. She was abducted in broad daylight. She was taken from her home, forced at gunpoint into a car, and driven away with no warning. And the ransom was sky high. It was $1 million, which was one of the largest ransom demands in US history at the time. For 2 days, the entire state was on edge. Federal agents flooded in, media trucks parked outside her family home, and through it all, Harvey's name was whispered amongst people who knew him. Because he knew details, too many details. He hinted at knowing how she'd been taken, where she'd been kept, what she'd worn, and how she'd escaped. And Virginia, somehow, through, sheer grit and luck, she did escape. She would later tell authorities about a voice, deep, deliberate, soulless, a voice that would later be matched to Harvey Carignan. It wasn't solely murder, though, that Harvey was accused of. It wasn't just sexual violence, it wasn't kidnapping, it was ransom, it was organised, premeditated horror, all of the above. But still, Harvey was walking free. They just didn't have the evidence, they needed more time. And by now, detectives were worried. Harvey was very clearly unravelling and fast, and we know his temper is bad. But worst of all, with the pressure that was mounting, he really was a man on the edge. There were whispers that he might be a flight risk, he might even run. Even just across state, the fact was he might disappear. And he did. He slipped away quietly. One night, without word, he was just gone, vanished. He drifted across state lines, Minneapolis, California, back again, never staying too long, never drawing too much attention. But wherever he went, something followed him. Bodies, young women, brutal killings or attacks, victims dumped in secluded spots just off highways. The pattern was unmistakable. And back in Minneapolis, Harvey's path collided with Merrill Townsend. She was alone, waiting at a bus stop. Nothing unusual. But out of the darkness, she heard something. The crunch of heavy boots on gravel. The harsh rhythm of someone breathing hard just behind her. And then, darkness. A brutal blow to the head sent her crashing into unconsciousness. When Merrill came to, she wasn't on the street anymore. She was in a moving truck, and her body was aching from the attack. Her face was completely covered in blood, and there was a man driving. She didn't know him, but his voice, his hands, his smell, they were all there, and they were unforgettable. He forced her into sickening acts as he drove, growling orders, all with one hand on the wheel and the other on her throat. But Merrill, battered and terrified, held on to one desperate hope, and that was escape. And then something changed. He yanked at her hair and yanked off her wig. Now, confused by her appearance and that causing some kind of hesitation, that was all she needed. She bolted out of the truck, into the night, and she was running like hell, and she made it out alive, but just barely. And with that, Harvey's life as he knew it was beginning to crack. He was becoming less careful, although I've got to say, it doesn't seem like he was ever that careful to begin with. He was just probably more stupid and lucky. And there's maybe a sign of the times with that, with regards to evidence collection and processing. But anyway, now, things were starting to catch up with him. And at this time, he was currently working in Minneapolis. He had this really drab apartment. The fridge was empty. Nothing was organised or clean or tidy. And worst of all, he had to cook and clean for himself, which he probably saw as a humiliation. This domesticity, it likely infuriated him. So he did what Harvey always did. He started writing. And what I didn't mention earlier was that he had a habit of writing letters. Pages and pages, all addressed to his ex, Alice. Quote, "Alice dear, people are lying about me. I've changed. I'm good now. I only hit you a little, and only when you made me angry." Come on, man, shut the fuck up. He swore it would be different unless she cheated. Then all bets are off. He literally wrote that. Oh, this man. When Alice didn't respond with the warmth he wanted, Harvey turned cruel. Unsurprising, I suppose. He would brag about women he saw in bars, waitresses mostly. One was named Alice too, and he told her that she was prettier than Alice, smarter. Each letter just showed his arrogance and bitterness. The image of this reformed man he pretended to be was slipping, and it was replaced by the real Harvey, this man who was consumed by ego and rage. These writings showed a dangerous mind spiralling. There were love letters on one page and then fantasies of dominance on the next. But meanwhile, in the background, Harvey was gearing up for his next attack. It was September 9th, 1973, when 13-year-old Jerry Billings stuck out her thumb on the side of a Minneapolis road. She was desperate. She'd run away from home and she was trying to reach her boyfriend's place in the city. With no phone, no bus fare, and no one else to turn to, hitchhiking felt like her only option. Of course, we're 1973. Mobile phones definitely aren't a thing. And so, and she's just 13. That is so unbelievably young, isn't it? My niece is 12 now, and to be fair, she's just tiny. Like, she could pass for a 7-year-old tiny, but imagining her doing something like this in a year's time, it's just unthinkable. So young and so vulnerable. And then these monsters out there who see this as an opportunity to exert absolute power and control. It is so, so sickening. So little Angel, 13-year-old Jerry, she was hitchhiking and thought she caught a stroke of luck when a pickup truck pulled up. The man behind the wheel smiled and said his name was Paul. He looked rough around the edges, but he was friendly enough, and Jerry, vulnerable and young, climbed in. At first, everything seemed okay, but Jerry quickly noticed they weren't heading towards the city. The man was driving in the opposite direction, out into the countryside. When she pointed this out, he waved her off, just taking a shortcut, he said. Gosh, how many times have we seen that in horror films or in real-life true crime documentation, let's be honest. But anyway, the speed picked up and Jerry got to suspect pretty quickly that this was not a shortcut. That must have been terrifying. Still driving, the man reached over and forced Jerry's head down. She fought back, squirmed, cried, tried to pull away, but he was too strong. When he finally released her, she gasped for air, but it wasn't over, not even close. He ordered her to take off her jeans, and then with a sickening calm, he took a claw hammer from the seat beside him, and he used the handle to violate her. Jerry was frozen in shock, but even that wasn't the end. He assaulted her again, and they were surrounded at this point by nothing but cornfields, 6 feet high, thick enough to kind of block out the world. There was just no one there to see or to hear or to help. Then, without warning, he pulled off to the side of the road. Jerry tried to run, but a heavy blow struck her to the back of the head and she hit the ground hard. He dragged her into the cornfield. There, isolated and hidden from sight, he tried again to assault her. Jerry screamed. She begged him to stop, and finally, for reasons only he understood, he did. He led her back to the truck, drove her silently back into the city, pulled over into this quiet suburban street and demanded she get out and not tell anyone. Jerry didn't know where she was. She was bruised and bleeding and terrified, but she did not go to the police. She didn't think anyone would believe her because she was essentially a runaway. Her own mother had disapproved of her choices, and Jerry was scared that instead of getting help to find this man, she would maybe be blamed, or she even believed that maybe she'd be arrested. When Jerry finally returned home, her mother, unaware of anything that had happened, sent her to juvenile detention for running away. I mean, look, I am not a mother, but come on, that is very clearly not what she needs. That's not going to help her, is it? Of course she doesn't feel safe or like she's going to be supported to tell her mum exactly what happened. And let me explain this for you, because it was difficult for me to understand, because she's not committed a crime, right? So why is she going to juvie? So at the time, this was 1973, running away from home was considered a status offence. That means it was only illegal because she was under 18. Not a crime in the adult sense, but still enough to get her locked up in a juvenile detention centre. And back then, that wasn't rare, it was almost routine. Basically, across the US in the 60s and 70s, thousands of kids like Jerry were detained not for breaking the law, but for breaking rules that adults had set for them. So, I don't know, things like skipping school or staying out past curfew, or like Jerry, trying to escape home. These weren't hardened criminals, they were kids in crisis. It wasn't until the 1980s that things slowly began to change. There was this thing called the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, JJDPA, and it began pushing states to rethink about how they treated vulnerable children. It was by 1980 that an amendment to the Act created a requirement. If states wanted federal funding, they had to stop locking kids up for status offences like running away. It's kind of wild, isn't it, when you think of it? It makes me think now, like, what things are in place that are just totally barbaric that maybe we don't know about, especially as someone who's not involved in lawmaking or in the judicial system. But anyway, fast forward to today, and most US states have followed through with that, i.e. stop locking up kids for running away, at least on paper. Running away is still considered a status offence in about half of the US, but only a small handful of states allow kids to be locked up for it, which, in my opinion, is still a small handful too many. Most states now try to connect runaways to shelters and social workers or family counselling, but even now, in states like Texas, Kentucky and Georgia, it's still possible, under certain conditions, for a teenager to be detained just for trying to leave home. Which is kind of mad, isn't it? Like, what about abusive households? What then? In the UK, I couldn't find that running away has ever been treated as a crime in that sense. British police treat runaway teens as safeguarding concerns, not offenders. The goal there is support, not punishment. I'm not saying that always happens, by the way. I know there are a lot of flaws in our system, but that's just like the official status and what has happened for years, officially. But in 1973 Minnesota, none of that nuance existed. There was no trauma-informed care, there was no victim advocacy, just juvie for this 13-year-old girl who was treated like a criminal when she should have been protected. It was only inside juvenile detention that Jerry finally found her voice. She told the whole story, every moment, every detail, but without a number plate, a license plate, without proper description, there just wasn't enough. And then her case kind of faded into the background, and while Jerry literally sat behind bars trying to make sense of what had just happened to her, the man who attacked her, the man who called himself Paul but was very clearly Harvey, he was still out there and he was still hunting. Just a little while later, on September 14th, 1974, it was late afternoon when 19-year-old Gwen Burton's car stalled in the parking lot of a Sears store. She was alone, frustrated, staring helplessly at the engine when a man approached her. He was friendly and smiling and helpful. He said he knew what to do, he just needed his tools. They were back at his place, not far. No charge, he promised he was just happy to help. Gwen would have hesitated because, given his demeanour, it wouldn't have felt right. But of course, it was broad daylight and she was stuck. So however she justified it to herself, she did agree. The moment she reached his truck, that smile vanished. His voice turned cold and he instructed her to get inside. And when Gwen hesitated, he grabbed her. That charming stranger transformed into something else entirely. Gwen was shoved inside, the doors were locked, and just like that, she was gone. He drove fast, away from the city, out towards the fields. He told her to sit closer, boasted about his martial arts training, about how he could kill a man in a second. Then he leaned in, looked her dead in the eye and said, "I could make a hooker out of you." Gwen tried to reason with him, begged him to let her out, but he only tightened his grip and called her a bitch, and what followed was pure horror. He strangled her until she passed out, and she'd wake up gasping, only for him to do it again. Her tears made him angrier. He would slap her across the face and beat her, and then, in a remote field, he laid out a blanket, forced her down, and assaulted her with the handle of a hammer, saying that he liked to see her suffer. Gwen even asked if he was going to kill her, but he didn't answer. He just punched her hard in the stomach. And then he raised the hammer and brought it down onto her head, again and again and again. Blood ran into her eyes. Her skull fractured beneath the force and she blacked out, thinking it was over. But it wasn't. When she came to, she was alone. Left for dead in the middle of a harvested field, she could barely move. Her head was throbbing with pain and she was bleeding and weak, slipping in and out of consciousness. Part of her wanted to give up, just close her eyes and sleep. But then she remembered something. Her sister was pregnant. If she died out here, she would never meet that baby. And that thought sparked something, a flicker of strength. Gwen started to crawl inch by inch across dry earth and rough wire. Her body was screaming out in pain, but she didn't stop. And she was doing this hours passed by until eventually she reached the roadside where cars passed, but they were too fast to actually see her, and her cries were hoarse. She was obviously incredibly injured, incredibly fatigued and exhausted, and she just couldn't make much of a sound. But then, a boy, this young farm kid, spotted her in the distance and ran for help. Gwen was rushed to hospital and she was clinging to life at this point. Her injuries were devastating. Bone fragments from her shattered skull had lodged into her brain. Surgeons worked for hours to remove them. She did survive, but the cost was high. She lost function on her right side. Her balance, her concentration, her memory, they were all shattered. She was forced to drop out of nursing school, and the sports that she loved, they were gone. Any life she had imagined had been stolen from her. Gwen's story, brutal, almost unimaginable, that was very similar to others like Jerry Billings. Also Meryl, the woman in the wig. The hammer, a pattern was certainly forming. Harry Carrignan's trail of terror had long left communities shaken. For years, he drifted from town to town, from Minnesota to Washington to California, but he was always seeming to be just ahead of the law and just slipping through the cracks. And around that same time as Gwen's attack, so this was in the summer of 1974, a woman named Eileen Hunley had started seeing Harvey Carrignan romantically. On the surface, he was charming, polite, even helpful. We know he had learned to be these things. That's how he lured women into his life, and how he got them to trust him. But it didn't take long for the mask to crack. Harvey's temper flared very easily, and his behaviour became erratic. And Eileen saw those things, and she just knew immediately she had to end it. She stopped calling, she stopped showing up at church, and she just kind of quietly pulled away. But then she vanished. No one had heard from her. No friends, no family, not a single trace. 5 weeks passed, and then, just outside the city, a body was found. Badly decomposed, hidden, dumped. Her face had been completely obliterated, smashed with a hammer until it was unrecognisable. We have seen that before, haven't we? And there was more. A thick tree branch had been shoved inside of her. A final, violent humiliation. The brutality was almost ritualistic, and yet somehow investigators did manage to identify the remains. It was her, Eileen Hunley, the woman who had once dated Harvey, the woman who had tried to walk away from him. Now she was gone, murdered in the most savage way imaginable, and Harvey, of course, was still out there walking free. Harvey's final known victim was Catherine, otherwise known as Kathy Schultz. She was young, beautiful, and full of life. She attended the Work Opportunity School, a place where she really thrived, but then, just like Kathy Miller before her, Kathy Schultz vanished. She just didn't show up one day. Panic gripped her family and they called the police. They were desperate to know where she was. But their answer would come soon enough. Hunters who were pushing through a field of towering grass stumbled across a woman's body, hidden beneath the corn stalks. It was Kathy. On September 24th, 1974, the police finally moved in. There were just so many examples now, so many pieces of evidence, and they finally felt like they had enough to arrest him. Harvey was read his rights, but he just waved them off, saying that he knew that shit, and he told them that they'd made a mistake. He was convinced he was going to let go again, and to be honest, why wouldn't he? He'd literally gotten away with all of his other crimes up to this point. The man went to Alcatraz after initially looking at the death penalty and then ended up walking free. So yeah, of course he thought history would repeat itself. And he wouldn't really admit to anything, but the detectives were not buying him. They pressed him on details on 2 girls he'd picked up just last week. But Harvey played it cool. He was pro at this by now. He told the detectives he had no idea what they were talking about. He'd never picked up 2 girls. He'd never even been to that specific area, and he'd, quote, never hit a girl. Yeah, okay, Harvey, we're just going to ignore all of your previous romantic partners' accounts then. Sure. And here's the thing. The detective actually hadn't even mentioned that specific area or hitting anyone. Harvey was now unraveling. He was just giving them this stuff. He was slipping up. Harvey did what so many manipulative predators do when cornered. He played the middle. We've seen that a boatload too, haven't we? That slippery, half guilty, half innocent thing. He insisted he hadn't killed anyone. No, never laid a hand on a woman in violence, of course not. But sure, he admitted maybe he'd picked up a couple of girls, dropped them off. Couldn't remember much else. Maybe someone else had come along afterwards and done the terrible things they were accusing him of. He shrugged, played dumb, played casual, but it didn't land the way it used to, and the detectives could see right through it. And they made another chilling discovery. They found a number of maps, not 1, not 2, but several, folded and marked, tucked away kind of like grim trophies. Each one was covered with tiny circles, and there were 181 in total, which is what I mentioned right at the top of this episode. Each of the circles were scattered across 7 different states: Washington, Oregon, Idaho, California, Montana, Wisconsin, and Kansas. Each circle denoted a remote spot, an out-of-the-way field, a wooded patch, a lonely bend in a rural road. Places with no cameras or witnesses, nothing. Investigators didn't know what those circles meant at first. They hoped they were something benign, places he'd travelled to, construction sites, maybe gas stations. But as they followed the markings, it became clear. They weren't just business stops, they were disposal sites, graves, dumping grounds. Some were close to known murders, others were linked to no one, no name, no face, no open case, but that didn't mean a huge amount. One circle led them back to that particular reservation where Kathy Miller's body had been discovered. Another brought them to the remains of a 14-year-old girl, left to decompose in silence, her name unknown. And in Harvey's truck, hair samples were found. They belonged to none of his confirmed victims. And maybe that's the worst part of this case. There are so many awful things, but what that means is that there are many, many more potential victims. Victims who have never made the news, and families that are still searching. Cases still marked runaway or missing under suspicious circumstances. Women and girls whose stories never got told, who just kind of vanished into ditches and ravines and weren't seen as important enough to warrant an investigation. In terms of evidence presented at trial, the real break came from one of the survivors, Gwen Burton. She was still lying in her hospital bed with her skull shattered and stitched together, and she was handed a photo lineup. She didn't hesitate. She lifted her hand and pointed straight at Harvey. That was him, the man who had tried to kill her. the man who told her he liked watching her suffer. She'd never forget that face. Investigators, now with cause, had dove deep. They had found that Eileen Hunley was connected to Harvey. He had been dating her. Her name had vanished from her rental lease. Her things were left untouched. Her paycheck was collected by Harvey himself. And the potential crime scenes, Harvey's truck, his apartment, they were pristine. Not just clean, but disturbingly so. Bleach, scrubbing, vacuumed twice. It didn't feel like hygiene. It felt like a cover-up. And I very briefly mentioned this a moment ago about the two girls that Harvey was like, no, I never saw them. Maybe I picked them up. Maybe I dropped them off and someone else got to them. Well, these two teenage girls, Sally Versoy and Diane Flynn, they had been lucky, kind of. I hate to use that word because there isn't a huge amount lucky about this. But what I mean is that they were lucky enough to escape Harvey before it was too late. Their statements matched the others. Same car, same tactics of how he'd lured them, same unrelenting rage. And it really seems that the catalyst for his arrest was when they found Kathy Schultz's remains. It was the same violence, the same weapon, the same twisted kind of signature. It was enough. So, the original charges were attempted murder and aggravated sodomy relating to various victims, but Harvey wasn't about to go quietly. He pleaded insanity, claiming he was acting under divine instruction and that God himself had told him to cleanse the world of immoral women. It was an excuse so wild and so self-serving that really it didn't even hold any weight. At trial, the prosecution revealed documents found in Harvey's cell, his writings scribbled with the cold precision of a man studying manipulation. He had written essays on sexual psychopaths and the way they dodge accountability. He described how to project sanity, how to act remorseful, how to avoid suspicion. They were the notes of a man driven by something horrific, and they were instructions from a predator. A true mental illness does not calculate. It doesn't clean a crime scene with bleach and tailor its rage only towards women who reject them. This wasn't delusion. This was design. Harvey was convicted on all charges relating to Jerry Billings. He was also brought to trial for the murders of Eileen Hunley and Kathy Miller. And despite all the evidence, despite the hair in his truck, despite the maps, the stories, the timeline, all of it, he actually was never charged for Kathy's murder. There were certain hurdles, there was lack of conclusive forensic proof, and so it just didn't go ahead. At sentencing though, the judge said, quote, "Your crimes are so grotesque they defy comment." And Harvey said, and this is just so disrespectful, but again, it's not surprising by this point, I guess. He said, quote, "Then don't comment on them." Psychiatrists had diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder. He received multiple sentences, totaling over 100 years in prison, effectively ensuring he would never walk free again. And here's how those were kind of broken down. So he was convicted in Minnesota for attempted murder and aggravated sodomy, and he received 40 years for that conviction. Later that same year, he was indicted for the murders of Eileen, which he received a life sentence, and Kathy Schultz. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received another 40-year sentence. His total sentence was 100 years plus life to be served consecutively. He died in prison in March 2023 at age 95, having served nearly 5 decades behind bars. Jerry Billings, the teenager who survived that pickup truck from hell, was later adopted by one of the sheriffs who helped bring Harvey down. She grew up shaped not by what had happened to her, but by what she survived. Gwen Burton lived too, but her injuries stole years from her. She lost her dreams, her balance, her ability to run, to dance, to feel safe. Her life wasn't ended by Harvey, but it was changed forever. And Mary, Kathy Miller's mother, the woman who first noticed the pattern, she had chased every newspaper story. She phoned detectives and chased them down for answers, and she became a quiet, unshakable force. She advocated for victims' families and she lobbied for parole reform. And she never stopped reminding the world that Kathy mattered, that all of them did. Harvey wasn't just a serial killer. He was a symptom, I think, of what happens when systems fail, and they do fail. We see it all the time. Violent men are allowed to start over again and again. And in this case, Harvey did that. And he did it sometimes with a new name, sometimes without one. But every single time, there was no one watching him. And that was how he was able to get away with being one of the most dangerous serial killers of our time.